Welcome back to the Space Alvey Institute podcast. I'm Andrew Petiprin in Texas with Bobby Mixa coming to you from Poland. Bobby, how are you?
I'm good, Andrew. Almost near the end of the school year. Things here end in June, so I'm near the end, but looking forward to the summer. And I might be in Chicago over the summer, so hopefully I can even maybe I have time to come to Texas. But I do hope to go to Notre Dame for a day or two. So maybe I'll stop by there. I have to finally meet this guy named Arthur Rossman. I've been in touch with Arthur for a while. So if Arthur's listening, look forward to me sending an email when I'll be out
Well,
there.
well, we hope Arthur is listening. And when you're in South Bend, we hope you'll also be able to call in on our guest for today, who is a return visitor, Philip Bess. We're really excited about this episode. It's going to be a little different than usual because here we are about 2 months, I think, into the baseball season. It's May of 2025. And we're going to talk a little baseball. We're going to talk a little urban design. We're going to talk about baseball stadia. What are they good for? And Philip Bess is here to talk to us about that. Philip has taught urban design and theory to graduate students at the University of Notre Dame School of Architecture for a long time. He is the author of numerous books, articles, and talks, and he was so kind to send me and you, Bobby, this great little book, which is sadly out of print at the moment, called City Baseball Magic. But we're going to leave a link in our show notes for how you can get a copy of this from someone on eBay if you'd like to have a copy. But let's get right into it. Philip, welcome back. How are you?
Thank you. I'm well. Nice to see you both, and thank you for having me back.
Well, it's great to have you back. We wanted to have you back anyway, but we thought of you, and you reached out to us. We've exchanged some messages, kind of in the wake of the election of our new pope, who is an American, and not only an American, but an American who has attended a game of the World Series, which is just kind of an extraordinary thing. He is a fan of the Chicago White Sox, as Bobby Mixa is. And Philip, you actually proposed an idea. You proposed a full-blown plan, as a matter of fact, for what could have been the very stadium that our current pontiff was sitting in when he saw that World Series game. It didn't come to fruition, but tell us about your plan for building a stadium for the White Sox.
Wow. So this goes back. This goes back a long way to the mid 1980s, and I was about 3 or 4 years out of architecture school and working in Chicago, and a baseball fan. I've been a lifelong baseball fan, and it all this tied into my sort of professional interest in what I was doing, and to a certain extent, the unhappiness of my work, not with respect to the people that I worked with, or even the quality of the work that they were doing, but just the general cultural ethos of architecture and its relationship to cities. And that's a big subject. And but it occurred to me, I think the first thing that I ever published of any notoriety was an essay on baseball parks, and how the generation of baseball parks that were built between 1909 and 1923 were very, very different from the ballparks that had been built since the Second World War. And insofar as the old ballparks were neighborhood baseball parks, and they were located on city blocks of a certain size, and generally had to conform to the configuration of the block that they were on. And so what that resulted in was a number of baseball parks. I mean, all the baseball parks were peculiar and were idiosyncratic, were distinctive. And of course, there are two ballparks from that era that remain in use, and one is Wrigley Field, and the other is Fenway Park. And both of them have been updated and renovated and have proven enormously popular and enormously profitable for their teams. But their significance is something more than just their financial benefits. And so the White Sox were talking about, the White Sox had a ballpark that was part of that generation, Comiskey Park, which is located on the south side of Chicago at the corner of 35th and Shields. It fit on a city block. But the White Sox ownership at the time, actually, who are still the owners of the White Sox, Jerry Reinsdorf is still the owner of the White Sox, had in mind a preference for a suburban ballpark, and actually wanted to be in the suburbs. And the model that he preferred was, in a certain way, innovative in its own right. It was Royal Stadium in Kansas City. It was innovative in the sense that it was suburban, but it was not a multi-purpose stadium. So that from about 19, it was the first multi-purpose stadium. I don't know, it might have been 64 or so. There were a bunch of them, that, Cincinnati and New York and Pittsburgh, Philadelphia. These were publicly funded stadia that were multi-purpose stadiums, and they accommodated both baseball and football. But what you had, what resulted in those ballparks was a kind of uniformity of character in the parks, the same kind of dimensions down the foul lines into the outfield, and I mean, again, if you think about what a baseball park is and the origins of the game, and there have been a lot of people who wax poetic about this. I wish I was more of a poet than I am, but the thing about baseball is that the playing field is potentially infinite. I think it might have been, it was W.B. Kinsella who said that the whole world could be a baseball park, because a baseball field, because what a baseball playing field is a diamond, which is of fixed dimension, that is the infield at a right angle. It's a 90-degree arc, but the outfield is a potentially infinite expansion. So if you have any 2 or 3 or 4 ballparks somewhere in the world, and you just imagine their foul lines extending into infinity, you know, the whole world, in a certain sense, becomes part of a baseball park. And so, but what happens is that in the history of the game, as the game became popular, enclosing the field, which began in the late 1850s or the early 1860s in New York, and of course New York City plays a big role, an outsized role in the history of baseball, generally. But those were the first enclosed baseball parks, and they were enclosed to profit from the game. As the game became popular, to charge people admission, and that's how professional baseball got started. And so the parks that were built in the teens, in 1914 to 1923, that was consistent. I mean, that's been the consistent history of professional baseball. But what they were trying to do, what made their fields idiosyncratic, is that they were trying to maximize seating capacity on a finite site. And that's why you got these idiosyncratic stadium configurations. It's why you got idiosyncratic playing field configurations. It also happened fortuitously at a moment in American history when there, in a certain sense, I'll speak generally, there were no bad public buildings built. And what I mean by that is that, it occurred during the heyday of the American City Beautiful movement. I think we may have talked about that on our previous broadcast, that the plan of Chicago came out of that, and Daniel Burnham was a significant figure in all of that. But it was up and rolling. In fact, I want to say, actually, gosh, I can't remember if the White Sox. No, I think the old Comiskey Park opened on September in 2000. In 1910. I think it was Forbes Field and Shibe Park, in Forbes Field in Pittsburgh and Shibe Park in Philadelphia, that opened in 1909, which was the same date as the publication of the Burnham Plan. So it's all of a piece with that. And so you had all these you had an architectural culture meeting a wealthy, industrial, confident American business environment, and what you got were the creation of baseball parks that were sort of fashioned after. In the case of Shibe Park, it was fashioned after a palazzo, in the same way that our great train stations, right, were fashioned after the old Roman baths, and so Unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, I mean, I think unfortunately, but the Shibe Park was in a way the most ornate that a baseball park got, because it was sort of, French classicism, industrial French classicism in Philadelphia, and it had arched windows, and it had columns and entablature. I mean, it was a classical building, and for a long time, actually throughout that entire generation, the ballparks were more or less classical in their design. But the point is that they were conceived as public buildings, and they were conceived as part of the city. And again, for economic reasons, they were located in neighborhoods, relatively cheap land. And the result was you got all of this character, right, in each of these ballparks. So if you know Fenway Park, you know that it has the Green Monster, and which is a 37-foot high wall in left field, because the street is right behind it. So it's a very short distance to left field and a very deep distance to right field. And other parks had their own peculiarities, the Polo Grounds in New York, many others, all the others basically. And so that began to go away with the suburbanization of the United States. So after 1950, I mean, there were some interim ballparks between 1923 and 1960, I think, is when Candlestick Park opened, 60 or 61, in San Francisco. There were a couple of transitional parks, like Cleveland's Municipal Stadium in Ohio sometime in the early 30s. I think it was a WPA. That was a big classical building. And then you had County Stadium in Milwaukee in 1948. That was literally, I think, the first post-war building, and was set out some distance from downtown. It was out in big wide county land. And of course, the difference between the old ones and the new ones is that the old ones were in a neighborhood, and you can get there. You could drive, but not that much. But they were embedded, and there were all kinds of things going on around them in addition to the outside shaping what the inside was like. Right, the inside could only go so far, and it was participating reciprocally with these other, with the city. And Bobby, if you come to Chicago, if the two of you come to Chicago, have you been to a game at Wrigley?
Oh,
Ever?
yeah, my mom's a Cubs fan, and her brothers. So my Uncle Paulie used to take me and my other cousin Michael Sean, same age as me, to the bleachers. We would go to for a game at Wrigley in the bleachers every summer. And let me tell you, the stories that came out of those games, that was quite a rowdy place to be for a young kid. But I loved it because we take the metro downtown Chicago from Oak Lawn, and then we get on to the Red Line and go up to the game. And let me tell you, I had so many friends on the South Side who they never saw Wrigley, never even went to Wrigleyville, the neighborhood. And I felt like the unique kid who, like for some of them, this was kind of I did something that was maybe quite evil to go to a Cubs game. But I was like, why don't we have this on the south side of Chicago? This is amazing. There is something so attractive and almost, I don't want to like exaggerate, but like wholly, fully flourishing in this neighborhood that I kind of was always a little bit jealous of the North Siders to have such a ballpark. So, I mean, I could go on, but I'll throw it back. Yes, I've been to many Cubs games.
Okay, well, great. Well, I mean, because then how the reciprocity between the ballpark and the neighborhood.
Oh,
And
yeah.
Comiskey, that existed also at the old Comiskey Park to a certain extent, never to quite the same extent. It was on rougher, more industrial land. I've got drawings of old Wrigley Field in 1923, and and again, Wrigleyville today has become a very gentrified neighborhood. In fact, they only start recently in the last 15 or 20 years started calling it Wrigleyville, but But it was a fully functioning neighborhood. Most of the buildings that are there on the city streets were there in 1915. The park opened in 1914 and went through a series of accretions, but it was a fully functioning neighborhood. Comiskey never quite had that, but it did have institutional presence of neighborhood taverns and there's a public park and a field house and there were schools there, but it was also confined. Well, you know what? I don't know what it was because now it's confined in between the rail yards that a major north-south rail line that runs to the west of Comiskey Park, and on the east by the Dan Ryan Expressway. Of course, the Dan Ryan Expressway only showed up in the 60s. So it'd be interesting to see what but it was a neighborhood park as well. But they were both working class neighborhoods. But the history of it since is that Wrigley has become less working class and more gentrified. Anyway, to go back, so these old ones contrasted with the suburban parks that not only had uniform, that they had uniform characteristics, both in terms of the building, but also in terms of the exterior, but also in terms of the interior. And of course, the major difference was that it was located in a giant parking lot, typically, or if it was located in a city like St. Louis when they built theirs, old Busch Stadium, the old one. It was that kind of suburban model, superimposed within the grid. I mean, the grid was sort of disconnected and reformed into what planners call a super block. And the purpose of a super block is to remove constraints upon construction. You want to consolidate enough land so that you can build the building that you want, and also have room for the parking that you think you need, and in many cases was needed. But the result, so I was approaching this from the point of view of someone who thought that the suburban experiment is a long-term mistake. It's very popular, and it's understandable why it's popular. In fact, I mean, I got to say that our Pope is from Chicago, but we really have, the odd thing is the Pope not only went to baseball games at the end of the World Series. I mean, this still, I just can't get my head around this quite. But the Pope is really Pope Leo is really our first suburban Pope. And I haven't heard anybody comment about that. He's not suburban in the sense that, I mean, he's obviously he's lived in great cities, and he's lived all over the world, and it doesn't mean that he's an advocate of suburbia. But on the other hand, it's what he grew up in, and so I imagine that he doesn't, I mean, we all have. I mean, I spent time living in suburbia, so it's just the way that America has been making its built environment for 75 years. So it's not a pejorative for me to say that, but it's kind of a mindset thing that we have never had a suburban pope. We not only never had an American pope, we've never had a suburban pope. So anyway, it was all that suburban stuff that was going on. And what happened was that the White Sox wanted to perpetuate that. They actually wanted to go to Addison. They wanted to go to a southwest suburb of Chicago and build a version of Royal Stadium, which was unlike the multi-purpose stadiums. What was innovative about Royal Stadium was it went back to being a single-purpose stadium, and Jerry Reinsdorf wanted that, and he lost a referendum in Addison, Illinois, by something like 50 votes out of several thousand cast, and so that was dead. And he had suitors that were courting him from. This is before the last major expansion. So he was being courted, I think, by Florida, by Tampa. He was being courted by Arizona. He was being courted by maybe Denver. I can't, these were all franchises that didn't begin until the 90s. And the White Sox never moved. But it turned out that Tampa St. Pete was the one that was most serious because they actually built a stadium on speculation, and used that to try to draw an existing major league team to Tampa. And the White Sox used that to leverage getting a publicly funded stadium for Chicago where they wanted it, and which was on the south side of the old Comiskey Park. That involved taking down, let's see, I want to say a working class African American neighborhood that was residents, the primary residents of that neighborhood, and that they took possession of that through the Illinois Sports Facilities Authority, which was created. It was a deal that was negotiated between Illinois Governor Jim Thompson, who's a Republican, and Democratic Mayor Harold Washington, the city's first African American mayor, and who I'm sure that this was unpleasant for him in so many ways to do this, but he neither of them wanted to be the governor or the mayor when the White Sox, under whose regime, right, the White Sox left town. And so they negotiated a deal, and it involved eminent domain and displacement, and I could see that coming well before it actually got described, because there had been I want to say maybe as early as 1986. This didn't all happen. The negotiations, the go-ahead for the new park wasn't really settled until, I can't remember if it was 87 or 88. I'd have to look about when the deal was right. I think it was 88. I think actually Mayor Washington had died of a heart attack in November of 87. But everyone was coy about where it was going to be. But there had been a little diagram that had popped up in the Tribune, like in January 1986, when they were talking about this, that showed a little diagram of a ballpark south of Comiskey, and I thought, okay, that's what's happening. Then everyone was coy about it after that. So anyway, I had this idea, right, that you could actually, I wanted to demonstrate in this project, which was, I don't know, to some extent it was like a glorified thesis project. It's architectural thesis project part 2, or number 2. But this idea that I wanted to demonstrate that you could design a baseball park that would meet the financial requirements of the team, the revenue generating requirements of the team, which of course are always expanding, right? And so that's another issue that we can talk about if you want to go there. But that could be done in the context of a neighborhood constrained by neighborhood, the size of blocks of neighborhoods, that it could preserve that by building on the north side of the old Comiskey Park instead of the south side, you could demolish the old Comiskey Park. And there's a preservation movement going on at the time too. And we didn't have the same agenda, and we became friends, but we were just trying to propose different alternatives. But our proposal was to demolish the old Comiskey Park, but retain the playing field and turn it into a public park that retained the baseball field. So it would become kind of a landmark public park, and then build the proposed new ballpark to the north of that, that's currently occupied by another public park called Armour Square. And so that led to the ballpark that we proposed to call it Armour Field, and that you would actually do infill projects and enhance the neighborhood on the south side, and rather than demolish it. And so and we proposed to do this in a context of creating I don't know, several 100,000 square feet of housing and retail and office buildings, essentially warehouse type buildings that can be used for just about anything. But that the idea would be to create a neighborhood environment around Armour Field and around Comiskey Park, and to show how that could be done and try to cost it out with the best available numbers that we had, which are, in retrospect, I mean, we were using the best numbers that we had, and in retrospect, they're so what stadium costs today have so far exceeded that. It's really astonishing. But at the same time, I think that the idea was a legitimate one in terms of, and it was a realistic one for doing it. But there were all kinds of stakeholders involved. And by the way, there was nothing like the Congress for the New Urbanism or a neo-traditional approach to design. There were probably, it was an era of architectural education, maybe a 15-year period from about 1975 to 1990, when architects kind of independently, influenced by a couple of, I'll say, important thinkers whose thought was actually wound up going off in different directions, but people like Robert Venturi and Colin Rowe and Leon Creer and Christopher Alexander were all beginning to explore ideas about that grounded building and architecture and dwelling with notions of communities, and in specific places that sort of moving away from the kind of hyper rationalist character of modernism. And but that had not coalesced into any kind of a movement. And so, to some extent, the project that I was doing was I was one of those outliers in proposing that. But it occurred to me later that I held a series as I got a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts, of all people, of all agencies, and also from the Graham Foundation, which was a local architecture foundation in Chicago, to do this work. And I did it over a period of about a year and a half, and wrote it up and drew it up, presented it. It was done under the sponsorship of the Society for American Baseball Research. And I drew it up, presented it to them, and actually got some press, some favorable press coverage. But there was no interest in it from the White Sox. But while I was doing this, while I was preparing this, I tried to identify all the stakeholders, and I had a sequence of meetings with them, serial meetings with them. And I've never tried or thought about anything at this scale and trying to think about all the issues involved. So it was an education in many ways. But I think the interesting thing is that I tried to do sequentially what later the Congress for the New Urbanism developed a methodology for, which is a community design workshop, which is known in the lingo as a charrette. That what I had tried to do in a charrette, you organize, you bring in all the stakeholders for a large design problem, and unlike who's the liberal theorist who McIntyre talks about him, who says that morality requires us to suspend our own interests when we engage.
John Rawls.
John Rawls, yeah. So it's John Rawls, and so it's the exact opposite of John Rawls, because the idea behind a new urbanist charrette is that everybody brings their interest into the charrette and is upfront about it, including the new urbanists, the designers, right? The design charrette team. But what the new urbanists, the design charrette team says, we don't have a plan, we don't have a preconceived plan, but we have a methodology and an understanding of urbanism that we believe solves a lot of the common objectives that people see in opposition to each other, and that actually what cities are, traditional cities are especially good at, are accommodating conflict. And so the idea was that the way that a new urban charrette turned out is that you invite everybody in, and over a series of days, you hear what they want to, they participate, and you hear what it is they're wanting, and you draw it on site, and you do that 2 or 3 times a day, and you stick it up on the wall, and 2 or 3 times a day everybody comes in and looks at it, and they argue about it, and they will refine this or refine that, and over a period of 3 days or 5 days or a week, you come to a kind of consensus about what the urban form should be, what it should look like. So you have a visual image in your mind, and you know that it's one that is trying to address all the problems that everybody has. And now, every kind of institution like that can be, or procedure like that can be sabotaged in the way that NIMBYs, who've, of course today been joined by YIMBYs, but the way that not in my backyard people who would be opposed to that would do is that they wouldn't come and participate. They would come and criticize at the presentation, right? That had come out of the ostensibly it's a poor substitute. It's a substitute. It's better than nothing, but it's a poor substitute for actually living in communities, right? Is that a charrette is designed to create a kind of community around a design that is necessary to pursue it by that means, because there is no consensus about what a good culture of building is, which it brings us back to McIntyre, right? So, so all these things are kind of going through my head at the time, but I didn't think about how what I was doing was like a single person, a solitary attempt to do a charrette in my own head and talk to everybody individually. And so it was totally a learning experience, but the methodology, I think the intuition was correct, because the idea was that there were everybody who has a different interest in this. We were trying to accommodate that in some way. Now, you can't accommodate everybody's interests all the time, but if you can work up a strong consensus, then you create opportunities for compromise, and compromises take place, and sometimes things get done. And I guess the only reason I'm laughing about this, thinking about this now, is that it was a project that the White Sox weren't interested in it, so it never, in spite of it's always gotten favorable publicity, but the White Sox were never interested in it. And then the White Sox did what I and everybody else kind of expected them to do, and it's been a disaster. It's been they had to renovate it within 10 years. They had to chop out 10 rows of seats. I mean, it was a and so, I mean, and to their credit, the White Sox have done a lot of things internally to the ballpark. The renovation was a good one, but it can't change that it's sitting in the middle of a parking lot. It can't change the scale of it. They've made it fan friendly on the interior, but it was a mistake. And I don't know of anybody outside the White Sox, except for inside the White Sox organization, who would not say it's a mistake. I mean, you said it yourself, Bobby. It's like, oh, I wish there was something like this, on the South Side. And I think, and it's interesting, because White Sox fans generally don't care too much for Cubs fans, and I have a lot of good friends who are White Sox fans, and I respect them. I like them as my friends, and I respect them as smart baseball people. But they tend to give me. I mean, I've been interviewed by a lot of White Sox fans about this ballpark, and they give me a pass, for being a Cubs fan, because they got what I was trying to do, and it wasn't just to try to make Wrigley Field on the South Side. It was to do something that would be unique to the South Side and to the White Sox. And so the thing that I get, every 2 or 3 years, I get contacted by, or somebody sends me an article by somebody who's just discovering the project for the first time, and they're writing about it and saying, "Oh, what a missed opportunity that the White Sox had." And there's nothing I can say about that. Yeah, I agree. I think it was a missed opportunity. I don't lose sleep over it at night. But gosh, you get a Chicago White Sox fan pope, and bringing attention to and the White Sox are in this really difficult. The White Sox in the city of Chicago are like in really dire straits.
Oh yeah, and they're thinking. I just was reading that Jerry Reinsdorf is thinking about relocating the team to Nashville. I mean, so I was thinking, well, maybe this is actually a scheme to get a new park, and maybe Armour Park will come about. But I saw your plan years ago. I think it was like the important anniversary for the Chicago Plan of Chicago by Burnham, and I think I went on your website, in which you have like the new Burnham plan, which we've already talked about. I encourage everybody to go listen to that great conversation. But I think on that website, you also have the plan of the, let me just make sure I'm getting, is it the Armour Park? I keep calling it Armour. Is it the Armour Field? Sorry.
Armour Field. Yeah,
Yes.
Armour Field is what
And
it's
I felt like a strong sense of anger when I saw this, like, some injustice again to the South Side that was done. And my grandpa, I mean, just maybe a little bit, I don't want to like rip on Jerry Reinsdorf too much, but my grandpa, when they were thinking about relocating out to St. Pete's, my grandpa wrote this long letter. He was a diehard Sox fan, baseball. Just anyways, he was hoping to be a professional baseball player. Went out, tried out for the Philadelphia Phillies, didn't make it, and I feel like it was kind of the great sadness of his life. But he baseball was the most excellent of all sports. He was a real athlete, but baseball was his thing, and he I remember he wrote this letter and they read it out on NBC News about kind of Jerry Reinsdorf and the lack of loyalty to Chicago. So I when I saw your park, I felt like this kind of, if you want to say, it's a loyalty to Chicago. And you do this thing where you're in the neighborhood, it's respectful to the fans. You don't demolish the other neighborhood, but you in some ways work it all together so it's a flourishing community. And we mentioned a little bit about Alistair McIntyre, just passing away last week, and I remember hearing a lecture by him at this was like a couple, maybe 10 years ago, on heedlessness, and he mentioned the South Side of Chicago, and he mentions it in the context of being a food desert, just completely kind of abandoned. And I thought, I'll be honest, because I saw your project, I thought, well, if this thing happened, then people would want to go to the South Side, and maybe it wouldn't gentrify like, Wrigleyville, but it would be much more of an actual like real community, and maybe reverse some of the suburbanization and the white flight. And anyways, but I wanted to just kind of ask you a little bit about, it seemed like in the 1980s when you proposed this, and you were mentioning this, how kind of the new urbanism didn't get going yet, but in the 90s, it seems like all these parks were been being built, especially even in the 2000s, which you think about like everybody tells me that one of their favorite ballparks is the new one. What is it called in Pittsburgh for the Pittsburgh Pirates? Um, is
It
it?
was called PNC Park, but I don't. The corporate sponsorships change all the time. I've forgotten now,
Yeah,
but
Well,
it's a
that's
beautiful
interesting.
ballpark. Yeah.
Yeah,
yeah.
and it replaced Three Rivers Stadium, and it's
hmm
located very near where the old one was, where the rivers
Yeah,
converge.
at the point. Yeah, it's a very cool location. They have the baseball park and the football field next to each other, and it used to be both of them in the same kind of horrible multi-use facility.
I didn't know it wasn't PNC Park anymore, so
Oh, it may
Yeah.
be. It may very well be. I just know some of them have changed, but
they
I
have.
that's the last I remembered. It was PNC. Yeah.
But can you maybe say a little bit more about like the idiosyncratic nature and also the kind of like regional nature of these ballparks? Because I know a bunch of people who, I never heard about a football fan doing this, but a lot of baseball fans will go travel around the United States and they'll go to a game, to each ballpark. And the thing they'll always come back and they say that it's like they're going to like really experience the uniqueness of each, like if you want to say, culture within that city, and they'll talk about the ballpark, they'll talk about the team, the fans, etc. And when you talk about like, in the 19th, post World War II, where you have a stadium in Cincinnati, which could be the same one that's built out in California, it loses that regional idiosyncratic nature to it, and it's kind of just a flattening of the culture.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, a big uh, fan complaint, uh, a big complaint among baseball fans that I know. I mean, what do I say? Peers of mine, demographic peers of mine, who've lived long enough to sort of see this series of transitions through three different generations of baseball parks, which is a little weird, right? Because these are big, expensive buildings, and they get built and they have a lifespan of 25 or 30 years, and they're not torn down for structural reasons, although some are in better shape than others, but they're torn down for financial reasons. And in some cases where they're repaired, they bring financial benefits, at least for the old ones. But it is an interesting thing that you note about the baseball pilgrimage, because it really, there's a lot of people who do this, and I like to say that in this respect, baseball is kind of like the Catholic Church, and it's they're both divinely inspired. They're simple enough to be taught to children and to engage children. They're complex enough to satisfy the highest intellect, and they're never entirely free from corruption among its participants and its leaders, and that's characteristic of both institutions in a certain way. And so you have religious pilgrimage.
There's up okay. Here. Yeah, we have the adoration, mystic adoration of the Lamb, and Wrigley Field.
Yeah. There's I don't know. I try not to get too misty or mystical about these things, but this is something that I read, 60 years ago, 55 years ago, an insight that has stayed with me, where Peter Berger, in this little book that he wrote called A Rumor of Angels, where he was trying to make an argument from, I want to say, really from a kind of a ground up argument, an inductive religious sensibility in an era where all religious sensibility was being denied. He said, rather than starting from dogmas, and teaching down, you start from experience and draw inferences. So very Aristotelian, very Thomist kind of approach. And he was a Lutheran of all things. But one of the things that he taught, he identified 5 ordinary sort of types of human experience that he called signals of transcendence, that we might, as Catholics, we might recognize as prototypically sacramental, or maybe sacramental itself in certain ways. But one of them was an argument from order, which is not an argument, the classical argument from order, but an argument from ordering, that human beings order things, and that in our ordering of things we are recapitulating or representing this larger order of which we're part. But the one that sticks with me related to this, to our conversation, is the argument from play. And he says that the argument from play is that whenever you're engaged in some kind of serious play, and play broadly defined, right, you step out of ordinary time, right? You step out of time into eternity. You have a kind of timelessness that is, you get engaged in some subject, maybe your work, if you're fortunate, right? You get engaged in something, and then you literally don't know where the time went, right? You're just doing. There's no sense of time in all of that, and I think that is a connection between the what a lot of people regard as the frivolousness of sport, and the truth of this sort of anthropological truth of how our play is an anticipation of the kind of timelessness of the kind of eternity of paradise. And anyway, so I've always been struck by the fact, as I've thought about this, and later became a Catholic. I wasn't a Catholic at the time. All of these things, like pilgrimages, right? And the pilgrimages that people make to these ballparks, and it's a kind of a human thing to do, but it maybe has theological implications. But all that is to say that the distinctiveness of each park. Well, I get. Maybe I've said enough. I don't know. You had asked a question. I don't know if I answered it. So maybe you rephrase it. I might have gone off on a tangent. I've never been known to do that, but
No, no, no. I'll hand it over. I mean, I could probably go on, but I myself, I mean, I always, whenever I approach a city, um, if it doesn't have a ballpark, and it's particularly a ballpark, I mean, I don't really care about the football stadium unless it's, the old Soldiers Field. I like the old Soldiers Field. But a basketball stadium, a hockey stadium, but it's a ballpark. And if a city doesn't have that, I feel like it really is a city, almost like a city without a church in the very center of the thing. And so you feel like you're in some ways there's this like a disruption in the cosmos. There's just some almost order that's off. And so, anyways, and that's always been kind of an intuition I've had. Um, and whenever there is something like, you think about, and I'm just wondering too, with these congresses that you've gone to for the new urbanism, like there might be some commonalities, almost like a pattern language, maybe as Christopher Alexander would call it, that it's like people want to go to something. You see people when they arrive in Krakow, they go immediately to the Rinnick. And there's just something about this that it's like, hey, it's good to be here. And it's almost like this is where the public social life happens. And I was just thinking if that was completely like, if you made Krakow into nothing but a grid, okay, without any public square, it would lose that dimension that is good for us. And I'm thinking too about just the ballpark. I love that ballparks are meant to be in cities. And anyways, I'll hand it over to Andrew. I could go on.
Well, Philip, I wanted to ask you, well, first of all, I just want to make one quick comment, and it's that when you were talking about kind of the almost kind of mystical dimension of baseball, I was thinking about how when the pitch clock was introduced, I was so annoyed because I thought that was like destroying one of the most beautiful things about baseball, which is that there's no clock. Now, since then, I've completely adapted, and I honestly don't even think about it. The game moves just fine, and it still, to me, conveys the same. You don't feel like you're watching a clock like if you're watching a basketball game or a hockey game or something like that. Um, but I don't know if you have a comment about that, and then I have another question about ballparks.
yeah, no, I agree with you. I think the insight is, but it's interesting. It's a corrective. It's ironic. I've come to think of the pitch clock, which I have come not to mind because I really enjoy the I really enjoy the increased pace of a game. I went to a game earlier at Wrigley this year, and it was 2 hours and 12 minutes, and and which is extremely rare. I mean, but they were never longer than three. They were, and you would get a few, and I've been to, some that have actually been under two, not very many, but we were getting 3 hour, 4 hour, 4 hour plus games. And it's a consequence of one of these things about how it, it requires thinking about what the telos of baseball is and whether the telos of it changes, or how the understanding of the telos of it is refined. But
Yeah.
the long games are a consequence of changes in how pitchers are used, which are consequences of statistical analyses of how well hitters do against pitchers who throw 100 plus miles an hour, and observing that hitters won't hit as well against six pitchers that throw 100 miles an hour in a game as they do against one pitcher that throws, sort of mixes things up, but goes 7 or 8 innings, and the third time through the order, they've seen him a couple times and so better. And so now the strategy is you don't let hitters see a pitcher a third time.
Right.
Get all these new pitchers in, and so they were changing pitchers. So now, I mean, so it wasn't just the time clock. It was that a pitcher had to face three batters, right? A relief pitcher. So that these are all tweaks that have been made. Now, I think the one that I really oppose, we're really getting in the weeds here, is the Manfred man, for the ghost base runner, and for extra inning games, trying to shorten those. So I'm not a fan of everything that they've done, but I think the pitch clock hasn't bothered me so much because it feels like it's getting it back more toward what what the pace of the game should be if it wasn't over specialized. I mean, it's a characteristic
Right.
of modernity. We over specialize things, and that's definitely applied to baseball. And so but it can go too far, right? If you specialize things too far, it 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 does compromise the joie de vivre of the whole enterprise.
Yeah, I mean, like increasing the pace of the game, it seems to me, doesn't necessarily change the dynamic of the fact that it's a sport that kind of doesn't operate by a clock, right? Because I mean, an inning can be as long or as short as the batters are productive, or right? I mean, you could have one inning that lasts a half an hour, or you could have, if the game goes to extra innings, the game could still last 3 or 4 hours, right? I mean, so you still maintain this sense of kind of, we're not quite sure what we're going to get today, and it all depends on sort of if somebody is hitting well or if the pitcher is doing really well. I mean, yeah, I mean, I listen to games on the radio, and sometimes they're 3 hours, sometimes they're 2 hours, and all with the pitch clock. But actually, that just brings me to the next thing that I wanted to ask you, which is, so backing up just a second, you had this idea in the 80s that like there's kind of prefiguring the kind of new urbanism stuff that's going to come, that hey, let's build this proper kind of community ballpark that has a kind of good embedded in it for the city that it serves or whatever. Now, I'm not so sure that philosophical side has been fully embraced, but it did happen, and Bobby already alluded to this, that in the 90s and beyond, they did start building ballparks that had more character to them again, and that were replacing these sort of just multi-purpose rooms or whatever. But a question that I have is, now I live in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and so it's a funny prospect to have something that's for the city, because my city is a kind of collection of cities that has 8 million people in it, right? And so they've put our football stadium and our baseball stadium in Arlington, in kind of this weird suburb. I mean, sorry, Arlington residents, but anyway, this sort of weird kind of middle suburb in between Dallas and Fort Worth, and there isn't a whole lot there. I mean, a lot of people live in Arlington, but there's the airport, and then there's an amusement park, Six Flags, and then there are the sports stadiums, and it's almost like that's where you go. Like if you live in Dallas or Fort Worth or Plano or wherever, that's where you go to partake of this professional sports thing, right? Now, the ballpark that we now have is this sort of domed, it's only for baseball, but it feels kind of like a mall when you go there. But the ballpark that we had before that was the ballpark at Arlington, which everybody praised as being this, beautiful baseball stadium. The only problem was it's over 100 degrees most days in the middle of the summer in Dallas. And, there were a lot of people who didn't like to go there. It was a place where it was actually kind of like, oh my gosh, nobody wants to play there because it's so hot and so unpleasant. So I guess what I'm getting at in this ramble is just like, on the one hand, we want things that kind of aren't just utilitarian, right? The Rawls thing before, but at the same time, we want things that we can actually use, that are in a place where maybe a large collection of cities can kind of come together. So I don't know, what do you make of that, like going forward?
Gosh, so it's a dilemma of modern life, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it's also as we've been talking about McIntyre. McIntyre. I don't know if I get the circumstance right. He said, trying to have loyalty toward the modern bureaucratic state is like, trying to have loyalty to, the phone company. At the time it was when AT&T, trying to have loyalty to AT&T. It's just, it's sort of this bureaucratic thing that performs a certain important modern function, but it's not a community builder in the sense that we think of community, where there are people who sort of actively engage. It's more like it facilitates certain things, better or worse, but it's not really something that everyone rallies around unless it goes away, right? And then people realize that it's a loss. So let me talk about what Bobby's observation about. I don't know, maybe it's yours, Andrew. The different ballparks in the 90s, the difference between the 90s ballparks and the multi-purpose ballparks. Where they were indeed, they started to be located in cities, right? And even if they weren't located directly in the cities, they started to address the aesthetic deficiencies of the previous ones, so that PNC Park in Pittsburgh is oriented toward the skyline of Pittsburgh, so that the new Comiskey Park is oriented toward the Dan Ryan Expressway looking south, and so they rotate at 90 degrees and they get a view of the Loop in downtown Chicago. The PNC Park, I mean, let's see, Baltimore, Camden Yards, it has some character by virtue of its reuse of the longest warehouse, the biggest warehouse in the United States, and oldest warehouse in the United States. It's 8 stories, 900 feet long. And in the early plans for a new Royal Stadium, I'm sorry, a new Orioles park, that was going to be demolished. And it was actually an architecture student, I think at Maryland, who proposed the idea of keeping the warehouse. And the same firm that did Camden Yards did the White Sox firm, but they were cutting their teeth. They were doing their first stadium, and they didn't, and that was their model, right? What they did at Comiskey was going to be their model for what they did in Baltimore, but they kept the warehouse, and so you have this. They integrated it into the design. The stadium is still quite a bit different. I mean, we haven't even talked about the difference between the footprints of the small footprints of the old stadiums and the big footprints of the new ones, and that how that affects proximity to the game, right? And the sort of the intimacy that comes from being, in close proximity to the game. And I'm sure we don't have time to do that. But if we just talk about if we understand that what succeeded the circular multi-purpose stadiums of the 70s, the 60s and 70s, were single-use baseball parks of comparable or larger size that had idiosyncratic playing field dimensions, just kind of imposed or selected randomly, right? That in the places where these idiosyncrasies were precedents, they came about largely as a consequence of site constraints. But in the new ones that they built, that have, like, I think it's in Houston in center field. Don't they have a terrace in center field, in deep center field, that runs up a slope? I think it's in Houston, and it comes from Crosley Field in Cincinnati, which had a terrace around this upward slope in the outfield all the way around it, and it was the precursor, or it was their version of a warning track, right? And a warning track is when the playing field out in the deepest part of the outfield changes from grass to dirt, so the outfielders know that when they're getting out into that territory, they know that the wall is is 20 feet away or 15 feet away, and so that they can prepare themselves for crashing into the wall or catching it or not catching it, but they know what's coming. And the thing in Crosley Field is really, I never saw it, but it seemed to be really weird, because I think it's a different thing when the surface changes under your feet to when the elevation changes under your feet. But there was no reason for that, to have that in the minute.
Yeah, I mean, if I could interrupt really quickly, I mean, I know here in Dallas at Globe Life Field, I think that the distances, like, I think the distance to left field is like I forget what it is, like 420, I forget what it is. But anyway, whatever number it is after the 4 is just the retired number of a famous Rangers ball player, right? And then the same on the right field line. And, I think to myself, sometimes if I were a hitter up there and I hit a 425-foot shot and it was caught at the warning track by the left fielder, I would be really annoyed, that the famous ball player didn't wear number 24 instead of number 27, like, because it's just arbitrary, right? But at the same time, I guess it's as good as I can hope for in a place like this, like that they're doing something different. It's not just, that they're trying to add some character, even though it does seem a little bit like a pastiche, right?
Yeah, no, it does. The other big thing about the difference between these are urban ballparks, but they're not neighborhood ballparks, right? They're all conceived and located in the city, but oftentimes there's activity outside my window. Is it disrupting? We'll see. Anyway, okay, we're good. So in these new ballparks, they're always conceived as part of an entertainment zone and as an anchor to an entertainment zone. And so in a weird kind of way, it continues to recapitulate in the city the idea of separate functional zoning, and which again is not one of the characteristics of neighborhood baseball parks. In a neighborhood baseball park, it fits into the neighborhood, but you've got all these other activities in the neighborhood that are in the vicinity, which isn't really the case in the new downtown ballparks. The thing I would say that a lot of them have done really well, and I'm thinking of Cleveland, I'm thinking of Detroit, I'm thinking of San Francisco, I'm thinking of Pittsburgh. They've done a much better job. They have a really good skyline, right, that they're playing off of, and so you do have the sense of even where you are, even in these modern ballparks, of being in a specific place. And so the aspirations of pilgrimage to experience these differences in baseball parks remains something that is worth pursuing.
Yeah, no, I think I mean we could go on and talk about these things for hours. But I think ending on that note about the pilgrimage nature, there is something I always tell my I guess it's international students. I try to make all of them baseball fans, and I've got a couple Korean students, and they're actually, I mean, I'm surprised how much they love baseball, and they're just so
Oh,
happy to finally meet somebody who knows the game a little bit. But there is something about the magic of baseball, uh, city baseball magic, that just is like, I think David Bentley Hart says that there's two great things about that America will be remembered for is baseball and jazz. And I love though that you're referring back to this era that for me at least is like this great era of American architecture, like the 1880s, all the maybe way up to World War II. Perhaps I've got this little book here. Well, not little. It's called The American Vitruvius. I don't know if you ever
oh my gosh, that's like
heard
the
of.
Bible of new urbanism.
Yeah, and so anyways, I always look back at this and I always say, well, if people are reading this, there's hope. There's hope in America. So that maybe thing that happened after World War II, up to the time maybe that I was born, um, I'd like to see that as maybe just you know, I don't know, going away from something that was shining here in the late 19th, early 20th century. But I love that because you think of America, and I won't go elaborate on this too much, but you think, okay, the city. You think Thomas Jefferson almost has this like agrarian notion of America, where it's like the city is bad. But I love it, and you mentioned this maybe the Catholic thing with the you think of Catholic immigrants coming to the city and making it really like this almost, yeah, kind of like a European, almost bringing that kind of European sensibility for the city to America, and almost perfecting it then with the baseball ballpark.
Well, there's a real tangible community of baseball. There's not a lot of, I think we have a lot of lots been written about the decline of communal enterprises and communal association in the United States. There's a genuine community of baseball, and so I think my hope in thinking about that project, and then sort of I think of that project as a kind of microcosm for an aspirational, kind of Aristotelian city at scale, or the city of God anticipated. But starting with a community of baseball, the hope was to engage people who don't necessarily have a particular interest in or sophistication about architecture, about cities, but they love baseball, and in thinking about it, they can understand because it's so palpable, the positive relationship between baseball and cities, both internal to the ballpark and with respect to its effects upon the game, but also with the place of the ballpark and the community baseball within a larger community.
Well, on that note, let's say long live cities, long live baseball, and maybe those who are thinking about cities and baseball in the future will give your plan, Philip, or plans like it, a look as they think to build again.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
On that note, to all of our listeners and viewers, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. We ask you to check out our website, spacesalvieinstitute.com, subscribe to our emails, and of course, share, like, and continue to follow these podcasts that we're doing. So until next time, God bless and live in hope.